The message arrived on a Tuesday, which struck me as absurd even then, that the oldest surviving civilization in the known galaxy had chosen a Tuesday to inform humanity that they would be named. That is how the Cathari convocation framed it, not an invitation, not a diplomatic overture, a notification. You will be received at coordinates appended below on the 44th day of the Cathari convocation's third administrative cycle, which translated, after considerable effort by the Bureau of External Affairs, to roughly 6 weeks from the date of transmission. You will send one vessel of appropriate bearing. You will not be armed in excess of navigational necessity. You will come to the Spur Nebula, which is ours, and we will look at you, and we will give you your designation among the peoples of this galaxy, and then you will depart and carry that designation home. I read the message 11 times in my assigned cabin on ISV Meridian Cross before I understood what was bothering me about it. It was the word ours. The Spur Nebula was not anyone's. It was not anyone's because it was 300 light-years across and contained 17 star-forming regions and was, by any reasonable measure of property, far too large for a single species to claim. And yet the Cathari had simply written the word, the way you might write my kitchen or our front step, a passing, undefended assertion that a thing belonged to you because it had always been there when you looked. I had spent 14 years in the Bureau of External Affairs. I had attended 42 formal first contacts, which sounds like a lot until you account for the fact that the Bureau had been running contacts for over 2 centuries, and I was still considered relatively new. What I had learned in those 14 years was that the way a species used the word ours told you nearly everything you needed to know about them before anyone said hello. The Cathari, it turned out, were the kind of species that had been using ours. For so long they had forgotten it was a claim. The ISV Meridian Cross was not, officially, a warship. This was technically true in the same way that a clenched fist is technically just a hand. The Meridian Cross was classified in the External Registry as a diplomatic platform, capital D, capital P, and she carried that designation on her hull registry codes and on all formal communications with the Bureau. What she was, physically, was something else. She was 840 meters of cruciform hull. The arms of the cross swept back at 17 degrees to a central spine that ran from the forward observation galleries all the way to the engine block, which was itself the size of a small town. She had been built in the Kepler yards over 11 years. Her hull plating was 30 centimeters of layered composite over a structural skeleton that could, in theory, absorb a sustained energy barrage long enough for the crew to decide what they thought about it. She had no weapons listed in the External Registry, because the Bureau did not list weapons in the External Registry for diplomatic platforms. And the Cathari, who had apparently been reading the External Registry, had taken this at face value. I did not know, at the time of our departure, what the Meridian Cross was carrying in her escort formation. Nobody had told me, and I had not asked, because in 14 years I had learned that there were things you did not ask about aboard diplomatic platforms, in the same way that you did not ask a man who works in a butcher's shop what the back room smells like. You know the answer. You don't need it confirmed. What I did know was that we were running dark. Running dark for a vessel like Meridian Cross was not a small thing. It meant all active emissions suppressed, no navigational pings, no drive signature, nothing that would show up on a passive scan as anything but cold metal and residual hull temperature. It meant the crew worked by discipline rather than convenience, which translated in practice to a ship that felt, for the first few days, like a submarine in the deepest part of an ocean nobody had charted. You spoke in lower registers. You walked with more attention. You noticed sounds you would normally filter out, the circulation of the atmosphere through the duct work, the faint oscillation of the forward observation gallery's structural members when someone walked across the deck above. We had been running dark for 11 days when the Cathari arrived. I was in the forward observation gallery when it happened, which is where I spent most of my free time during the transit. The gallery was a wide, low-ceilinged space at the very tip of the ship's forward arm, with a single curved viewport that looked out over the nebula. The nebula, the Cathari's Nebula, was extraordinary, layers of ionized gas in amber and deep violet, lit from within by a young star cluster that had been forming for about 8 million years, which the Cathari would have considered recent. The gas clouds moved slowly enough that you could not see them move at all, and the effect was of something ancient that had simply stopped, suspended in a moment of becoming that had been going on longer than our species had known fire. I had been sitting with my tea going cold for about 20 minutes when the gallery's ambient lighting shifted one shade, barely perceptible, from the warm amber it had been holding to something slightly cooler. That was the signal, not an announcement, not an alert, just the lights, ticking one shade toward blue, because Commander Osai had decided months ago that the approach signal would be something that a person could register without jumping. I put down my tea. The Cathari fleet came out of their translation point approximately 40,000 kilometers ahead of us, which is close for a fleet of that size, and suggests they were confident they knew exactly where they were and exactly what they were arriving to meet. And it was a fleet. I want to be clear about that, because the message had said one vessel and the Cathari had sent something considerably more than that. I counted later from the sensor log, 23 ships. The flagship alone was over a kilometer long, its hull a design I had never seen and could not easily categorize. Organic in its curves, the way bone is organic, with a surface that caught the nebula's light and scattered it in spectra that suggested the material was doing something more complicated than simply reflecting. The escort ships were smaller but not small, fanned out in a formation that was clearly ceremonial, equidistant, perfectly arrayed, the kind of positioning that requires either very sophisticated automation or very long practice. Probably both. They were magnificent. I mean that without irony, even understanding what they had come to do to look at us and name us, in the way that a museum curator names a new exhibit. They were magnificent. The Cathari convocation had been a spacefaring civilization for somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years, depending on whose estimate you believed. Their ships showed it, not in ornamentation, not in excess, but in the quality of absolute confidence. Every line of every hull said, "We have been doing this for a very long time. We know exactly what we are." I watched them arrive and I thought about what it must have felt like to the Cathari flag crew in those first seconds. They would have been watching their approach sensors. They would have seen the nebula ahead of them, the Spur Nebula, their nebula. They would have been looking for one ship. They would have seen nothing. Because we were still running dark, Meridian Cross was sitting right where we had been sitting for 11 days, approximately 12,000 kilometers off the Cathari formation's projected approach bearing, and we were invisible. The escort formation was invisible. Everything was invisible. I found out later from Commander Osai that the Cathari flagship's first transmission after arrival was directed at the general address of the empty space ahead of them. It was in Cathari Standard, which our translation systems had been working on for 3 years, and it said, approximately, "We have arrived at the designated point. We are ready to receive the human representative." We did not answer. The second transmission came 4 minutes later. It said, "Human vessel, please acknowledge." We did not answer. The third transmission came 11 minutes after that. The tone, according to our linguistic analysis systems, had shifted. Not to alarm, not to anger, the Cathari did not appear to do either of those things quickly, but to something the analyst on duty described in his log as a recalibration of expectation. They had come to name a young species in a familiar nebula, and the young species was not where they had expected it to be, and this was producing, in the Cathari, the particular discomfort of a scholar who opens a book to a page they have read many times and finds the words different. The third transmission said, in translation, "We acknowledge that we may be in error regarding the coordinates. Please indicate your position." Commander Osai's voice came over the gallery's internal channel at that point, quiet and even. "Dissa, you might want to hold on to something." I was already holding onto the viewport frame. I am not sure when I had taken hold of it. I think it was when the third transmission came in, when I understood what was about to happen. What happened was this. Meridian Cross ceased running dark. For a vessel that had been holding complete emission silence for 11 days, ceasing to run dark is not a gentle process. It is the difference between a closed fist and an open hand, and it happens in approximately 4 seconds. The drives came alive. The navigational systems came alive. The sensor arrays came alive. The hull lighting, which on a ship the size of Meridian Cross runs in strips along the structural ribs and across the engine housings and up the full length of the central spine, came alive. 840 meters of cruciform warship that was not a warship went from invisible to present in 4 seconds, at a distance of 12,000 kilometers from the Cathari flagship's forward sensor array. I heard, and I want to be precise about this, because it sounds like something a storyteller adds for effect. I heard the ambient noise of the gallery change in those 4 seconds. The almost silence of the dark transit, which I had been living in for 11 days without quite registering how complete it was replaced by the low, steady hum of the Meridian Cross fully alive. The viewport in front of me, which had been showing me only nebula, was now also showing me the edge of our own hull's lighting. The amber running lights along the forward arms port edge, right at the periphery of my field of view, burning steadily in the violet gas. The Cathari flagship's response to our appearance took 37 seconds. I know this because I was counting. In the kind of civilized, orderly contact scenario the Bureau preferred, 37 seconds of silence from a counterpart is nothing. It is a polite pause, a moment for translation and formulation. In the context of what was happening at that moment, 37 seconds of silence from the Cathari flagship was a very specific kind of sound. It was the sound of an extremely old, extremely composed institution encountering something that did not fit its existing files. Then the escorts began to light up. Not weapons. I should be clear. The Cathari did not power weapons. What they did was begin scanning. Active scans, full spectrum, the kind that you do not run on a contact vessel as a courtesy because they are, in the vocabulary of interstellar relations, the equivalent of grabbing someone by the collar to get a better look at their face. They were running them on Meridian Cross, and I understood from the change in the bridge crew's posture. I could see the bridge crew from the gallery through the internal glass, that our sensor systems were logging the contact, characterizing the beam types, building a picture of what the Cathari were doing. Commander Osai said nothing. The crew said nothing. They watched the scan data come in and they let the Cathari look because that was the plan. We had been the thing in the room that no one had seen yet. Now they were seeing us. And then the escort formation lit up again. Not scans this time. And I felt the change in Meridian Cross before I understood it. The way you feel a temperature drop before you consciously register that it's colder. The ship's passive defense systems had noticed something and had responded to it. And the response was the particular kind of quiet readiness that does not look like anything from the outside and is, from the inside, unmistakable if you have spent enough time aboard a diplomatic platform. I had spent enough time. The Cathari were not targeting us, but they were looking at us the way you look at something you are deciding whether to step around or step over. Commander Osai's voice came over the channel again. "Dissa, could you come to the bridge, please?" The bridge of ISV Meridian Cross was a long, horizontal space running across the full width of the command arm, with stations arrayed in 2 tiers facing the forward viewport. It felt, when fully crewed and operational, something like the nave of the cathedral it had been named for, the same sense of a space designed for a specific kind of concentrated purpose, where the ordinary rules of casual conversation did not entirely apply. Commander Osai was at the central station, not seated, standing with one hand resting on the console in the way she stood when she wanted to appear relaxed without committing to it. She was a tall woman, Commander Osai, with gray at her temples that she had not bothered to correct, and a way of looking at things that always gave the impression she had already considered the outcome before it happened. She had commanded 4 previous contact operations. She had been the officer on deck during the Voron engagement, which was the only formal first contact in Bureau history that had ended in a weapons exchange, and she had handled it in a way that the subsequent inquiry had described as exemplary restraint under extreme provocation, which was bureaucratic language for she did not return fire even when the Voron hit us twice, and it turned out to be the right call. "The Cathari are composing a transmission," she said when I arrived. "Linguistic is working on real-time translation. I'd like you on the channel when it comes in." "What are they scanning for?" I asked. "Weapons," she said it the way you say a word you've said many times. "They're trying to determine what we're carrying." "And what are we carrying?" She looked at me for a moment. "What we're always carrying," she said. "Come and stand here." I stood where she indicated, at the secondary station to her left, which put me facing the forward viewport at an angle. The Cathari fleet was visible to the naked eye at this distance, the flagship as a bright point that was slightly wrong, slightly too structured to be a star, and the escort formation arranged around it in its perfect equidistant fan. Beautiful and very still, the way things that are trying to process something unexpected go still. The transmission came in at 48 minutes after our decloaking. By then the Cathari had been scanning us continuously for most of that time, and our systems had built a fairly comprehensive picture of what they were doing and, more importantly, what they were finding. The weapons systems they were looking for were not in the places they were looking. The Meridian Cross's active armament was distributed through the hull in ways that a passive scan could not easily characterize, because the housings were not shaped the way weapons housings in this part of the galaxy tended to be shaped. The Cathari had been cataloging the weapons of other species for tens of thousands of years, and our weapons did not look like any of them. Which was not an accident. The transmission came through in Cathari Standard and Linguistic, put it on screen in parallel translation, the Cathari script running on the left and our approximation in Standard running on the right. I read it twice. It said, in translation, "We greet the vessel Meridian Cross of the human designation. We note with interest that your vessel is larger than the description provided in the external registry. We note further that the configuration of your hull is not consistent with a navigational vessel. We are prepared to receive your senior diplomatic representative for formal designation proceedings. We ask that you explain the discrepancy in registry description before the designation is conferred." I looked at Commander Osai. She was reading the same text. "They want me to explain the ship," I said. "They want you to explain the ship," she confirmed. "How would you like me to explain it?" She thought about this for a moment. "Accurately," she said, "but at your own pace." I composed my response carefully, with linguistics' help for the Cathari Standard rendering, though I wrote the substance myself. I said, "We thank the Cathari Convocation for their greeting. The ISV Meridian Cross is registered as a diplomatic platform, which is an accurate description. Diplomatic platforms in human service carry the equipment appropriate to a range of diplomatic circumstances. We look forward to the designation proceedings, and are prepared to receive the Archkeeper's delegation aboard Meridian Cross at their convenience." I did not explain the ship further. The Cathari asked what I had on the ship, and I told them what the ship was. These are not quite the same thing. There was a longer silence this time, 91 minutes, during which our sensors logged the Cathari formation undergoing several internal configuration changes, ships adjusting position relative to one another, some kind of internal communication pattern that our systems flagged as unusually intensive for a fleet at anchor. The analyst on duty described it in his log as a formation engaged in significant consultation. The word he used later in conversation was agitated. He walked it back immediately, because agitation seemed like the wrong word for the Cathari convocation, but I think he was right. What the Cathari had come to do was name us. They had a file for this. They had been naming species for 40,000 years, and they had a procedure and a vocabulary and a formal structure for the naming, and the structure assumed certain things. It assumed the species being named was younger than the Cathari, less experienced, and appropriately humbled by the occasion. It assumed the naming party arrived, and the named party was present and waiting in the designated place, visible, which is to say legible. It assumed the designated place was somewhere familiar. We had been waiting in their nebula for 11 days, invisible, in a ship larger than anything in their external registry for human vessels, and we had not announced ourselves. We had let them arrive and scan empty space, and send 3 transmissions into silence before we chose to appear. This was not, to be fair, what the Bureau's formal contact protocol specified. The protocol specified that we arrive at the designated coordinates and await the Cathari fleet's arrival and present ourselves appropriately. The protocol did not specify that we run dark for 11 days in the nebula before the Cathari arrived, or that we maintain that silence through 3 Cathari transmissions, or that the Meridian Cross not be the only human vessel present. Commander Osa had made modifications to the protocol. She had, I suspected, been making modifications to this particular protocol for considerably longer than the 11 days we had been in the nebula, and the Bureau had not objected to those modifications in writing, which in Bureau culture means the Bureau is pretending not to know about something it has, in fact, approved. The Cathari's second transmission came 91 minutes after the first and said, in translation, "We have reviewed our sensor data regarding your vessel. We find we have additional questions regarding the nature of your diplomatic platform's complement. Specifically, we ask for clarification regarding the drive signatures we are detecting beyond your immediate position. Please confirm whether additional human vessels are present in this sector." I looked at Commander Osei again. "Now?" I asked. "Now," she said. She made a single gesture to the officer at the communications console, and the officer relayed a signal I did not see transmitted and could not have characterized if I had seen it, and then the nebula outside the forward viewport changed. It changed the way a room changes when all the lights come on at once. The escort formation had been holding position in a rough sphere surrounding the Meridian Cross, distributed through the nebula gas at distances ranging from 800 kilometers to about 30,000 kilometers, in vessels ranging from fast corvettes to 2 ships whose hull classifications I had not seen before and could not name. I do not know the exact count that was visible to the Cathari sensors in those first seconds. The count I was given later for my contact report was 41 vessels. The Cathari, at the moment of emergence, were looking at a fleet. Not a display fleet, not an honor guard in the ceremonial sense. A working fleet, equipped for the range of circumstances that a working fleet is equipped for, which in this part of the galaxy, at this point in history, included circumstances that the Cathari had probably not encountered in several thousand years, if ever. I watched the Cathari formation's lights. The Cathari ships were, as I said, beautiful. Their hull illumination was a steady, deep amber, the color of old amber, the fossilized kind, not warm but not cold, a color that suggested something preserved across a very long time. When the escort fleet appeared around us, the Cathari ship's illumination changed. It was subtle, a slight shift in the frequency of the amber, a modulation that our systems flagged, and that linguistic, after some effort, characterized as a stress response in the ship's bio-integrated lighting systems. The Cathari ships were, in some functional sense, alive, and they were registering something. The Cathari flagship's third transmission came in 4 minutes after the escort fleet's appearance, and it was short. It said in translation, "We acknowledge the presence of your fleet." That was all. No designation, no ceremony, no formal structure, just, "We acknowledge your fleet," which in Cathari standard is approximately the same thing as saying, "We see you and we are deciding what we see." I stayed on the bridge for the next 6 hours. Commander Osai did not tell me to leave and I did not volunteer to go, and we reached a kind of understanding about that without discussing it. She brought me tea at some point, which I found unexpectedly kind, and we stood at the forward viewport and watched the Cathari formation hold position, which it did without moving for the full 6 hours, and we talked when we talked, about things that were not the fleet or the Cathari or the designation. She told me about the Voron engagement. Not the official version, which I knew from the inquiry report, but the actual version, which was smaller and stranger and considerably more human. I told her about my first contact, which had been with a species called the Thurvan, and had been deeply unremarkable, and had resulted in a trade agreement for a class of industrial lubricant. We found this funny in the way that people find things funny when they are sitting still in a tense situation, and the tension has gone on long enough that it needs somewhere to go. At the 6-hour mark, the Cathari flagship's fourth transmission arrived. It was long, the longest transmission we had received from them, and Linguistic worked on it for nearly 20 minutes before they were confident in the rendering. Commander Osai and I read it together on the translation screen, and I will not reproduce it in full here because parts of it were in Cathari ceremonial register, which translates poorly and at considerable length, and the relevant substance can be conveyed more briefly. The Cathari Archkeeper, who was addressing us directly for the first time, said the following things in summary. The Convocation had prepared a designation for humanity based on the data available to them at the time of preparation, which had been the human species' own external registry submissions, their formal interstellar communications, and the indirect observations the Cathari had been making of human space for approximately 240 years. On the basis of this data, the Convocation had prepared to designate humanity as a Class 5 emergence, a young species, capable but not yet settled in the first centuries of its galactic presence, requiring guidance and contextualization from more established powers. This was, the Archkeeper was careful to note, not a diminishment but a classification, the way a geologist classifies a rock formation, descriptive, not evaluative. The Archkeeper then noted that the data currently before the Convocation did not support a Class 5 designation. She did not specify what class the data supported. She said instead that the Convocation had determined that their preparation had been insufficient and that they required additional time for review before the formal designation could proceed. She said that the Convocation had noted several things about the human fleet's configuration and the Meridian Cross's hull specification that were not consistent with external registry submissions, and that this inconsistency required examination. She said that the Convocation was not, at this time, in a position to proceed with designation proceedings. She said at the end, in a register that Linguistic flagged as personal rather than formal, "We had expected to find you waiting." I sat with that sentence for a long time. We had expected to find you waiting. There was no accusation in it. The Archkeeper was not a species that did accusation in this register. There was something else, something that, in a human speaker, I would have called the particular discomfort of a very capable person discovering that a situation they had prepared for thoroughly is not the situation they are actually in. The Cathari had prepared to arrive and find one human ship, at the designated coordinates, having come because the Cathari had sent a notification. They had prepared to name it. They had prepared to explain to it, with the considerable patience of a 40,000-year-old civilization, where it stood in the order of things. They had arrived to find a fleet that had been sitting in their nebula for 11 days, invisible, waiting for them. We had not come because they had sent a notification. We had come and arrived early and gone quiet and waited, which is a thing you do when you are in someone else's territory, and you want to understand the territory before you are seen in it. And it is also a thing you do when you are not particularly concerned about being in someone else's territory, and you would like that to be evident without anyone having to say it. I composed the response myself without Commander Osai's input, though she read it before I sent it. I said, "We thank the Cathari Archkeeper for her candor and for the honor of her personal address. We respect the Convocation's need for additional time. We note that humanity has been in space for approximately 4 centuries. We note further that 4 centuries is a relatively recent development in the full span of our species' history, and that we are accustomed to the experience of arriving somewhere and finding that the existing understanding of us is incomplete. We are prepared to wait at your convenience for as long as the review requires." Commander Osai read it and said, "That last line." I said, "Yes." She said, "Leave it in." I left it in. The Cathari took 3 days. 3 days of near silence, the fleet maintaining its position, the Cathari formation maintaining its position, the nebula doing what it had been doing for 8 million years, which was forming stars slowly. I used the time to write my preliminary contact report, which occupied about a day and a half, and to sleep, and to stand in the forward gallery and watch the nebula, and think about what it meant to be the thing in the room that nobody had correctly estimated. On the first day of the wait, one of the junior communications analysts knocked on my cabin door and asked if I thought the Cathari would eventually fire on us. She was young, first deployment, I would learn later, out of the academy 9 months, and she asked the question with the kind of careful neutrality that young people use when they want to demonstrate that they are not alarmed, which is itself a form of being alarmed. I thought about it honestly. "No," I said, "they're old things don't move quickly. And they're not angry, they're recalibrating. Those are different processes." She considered this. What does recalibration look like from the inside of a ship that's doing it? From what the Archkeeper wrote, I think it looks like 23 senior advisors sitting in a room together and arguing about what century they're living in, I said. She laughed at that, a genuine laugh, the tension going somewhere, and thanked me and left, and I sat back down at my desk and thought about the fact that I had answered her question with confidence I only partially felt, and that this was also, in its way, something the Origin teaches you: how to hold your shape in a waiting situation, how to keep the confidence in your voice clear and steady, even when the confidence in your chest is doing something more complicated. We were not afraid of the Cathari. I want to be accurate about this, because it is easy to simplify it. We were not afraid of the Cathari fleet, which was 23 ships against 42, and which had been designed, by the look of it, for a galaxy in which nothing had seriously challenged the Cathari in several thousand years. We were not afraid of the Archkeeper's assessment, because whatever she concluded, we had not been classified yet, and not being classified meant the Bureau's response options were still fully open. We were not afraid of the 3 days of silence, because 3 days is not long, not for a crew that had spent 11 days running dark without incident. What we were, I think, was alert. The particular kind of alertness that a species develops over the course of a very long history of finding itself in situations it had not planned for, not fear, not anger, but a kind of broad, patient readiness that scans every incoming signal for information without flinching at what the information might be. The crew of Meridian Cross walked the corridors of their ship during those 3 days with the same economy of motion they had maintained throughout the dark transit. And if you had been watching without knowing the context, you would not have seen alarm. You would have seen professionals at work, in the ordinary rhythm of a ship at station keeping, with a fleet outside and a very old civilization 40,000 kilometers away, reconsidering its position. I found this admirable if I am being precise about it. I have been in contacts where the waiting produced visible strain. You could see it in the break room conversations, in the way the crew's humor shifted from dry to brittle, and those contacts were not, on balance, the ones that went cleanest. This crew's quality in those 3 days was the most effective thing we put in front of the Cathari. Not the fleet, not the hull spec, not the weapons they couldn't fully read. The stillness. The complete absence of fidgeting. In a ship full of people who were waiting to find out how an ancient civilization intended to file them. On the second day, I asked Commander Osai what she expected the Archkeeper's designation would look like when it came. She was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was deciding how much of what she thought was useful to share. "I don't think it'll be a number," she said finally. "The Class 5 framework, that's a framework built for species that fit an established pattern. We don't fit it. They'll need something else." She looked out at the Cathari formation. "The question is whether what they settle on is the beginning of a conversation or the end of one. Which would you prefer?" "The beginning," she said. "Endings don't require fleets." On the evening of the third day, the Archkeeper's personal shuttle crossed the 40,000 kilometers between the Cathari flagship and the Meridian Cross and docked at our forward shuttle bay. I was there to meet her. I had prepared for the meeting with the same approach I used for all contact meetings, which is to say, I had prepared thoroughly for the questions I expected and left considerable room in my planning for the questions I hadn't. I had a full briefing packet from Linguistic on Cathari greeting protocols. The correct posture, the correct sequence of address, the formal register used for first direct encounters with a new designation subject, the specific verbal constructions that were polite versus those that were technically correct but carried undertones I would want to avoid. I had reviewed the Bureau's previous indirect data on the Archkeeper herself, which was sparse. She had held the senior administrative role in the convocation for approximately 300 years, which in Cathari terms made her relatively new to it. She had presided over 41 designations. She had, according to the Bureau's long-range observation logs, not left Cathari space in over a century. She had left it now. The Cathari are bilaterally symmetrical, which is something humanity shares with more species than you might expect. They stand between 2 and 2.4 meters tall in their upright posture, and they have a posture that is genuinely, architecturally upright. Not the slight forward lean that many bipedal species carry as a legacy of evolution, but a vertical alignment that looks, to a human eye, slightly formal, as though they are always at a function. Their surface coloration is variable, not the chameleon kind of variable, but the kind that changes slowly over the course of a lifetime, so that a very old Cathari is a different color than a young one. The Archkeeper was, by our best estimate, somewhere between 600 and 800 years old. She was the color of deep water. She had 2 attendants, who stayed near the door, and she walked to the center of the bay and looked at me with eyes that were positioned on the sides of her head rather than the front, which gives the Cathari a field of vision that covers most of a sphere and contributes to the impression that they are always looking at everything at once. She looked at the shuttle bay for a long time before she looked at me. I did not hurry her. The shuttle bay of the Meridian Cross is a large, functional space, not designed for ceremony, not dressed for a meeting of this kind, but clean and purposeful in the way that working spaces are clean and purposeful, with the kind of organization that happens when people who do a job seriously have been doing it long enough that their systems have settled into the most efficient arrangement. She looked at the equipment racks, the tool stowage, the structural ribs of the hull visible through the overhead lighting. She looked at the far bulkhead, which had 2 impact-rating plaques and a maintenance log in standard print, and a secondary safety system panel that was currently dark, and which was, I was conscious of this as she looked at it, clearly older than the systems adjacent to it. Repaired, maintained, Old machinery kept running because it still worked, not replaced because something newer existed. She looked at all of this, and then she looked at me. I introduced myself. She replied in Cathari Standard, which was rendered in my earpiece in real-time translation at approximately 1 second of lag. She said, "You are the human speaking for the vessel." "I am the human speaking for humanity," I said. "The commander speaks for the vessel." A pause. Is this distinction significant? "We find it useful," I said. She looked at me for a moment in the way that the Cathari look at things, which is very thorough. Then she said, "We had prepared a designation." "We understood that," I said. "We were honored by the attention." "It was inaccurate." "We were prepared for that possibility," I said carefully. "Classifications of new things often require revision." She was quiet for a moment. Behind her, through the shuttle bay's small viewport, I could see the edge of the nebula, the amber-violet layers of ionized gas that the Cathari had been looking at for longer than human civilization had existed in any recognizable form. "How long have you been in space?" she asked, not the external registry answer. She was asking the question I would answer honestly. "Effectively 4 centuries," I said. "In our own solar system longer, but in space, as a spacefaring people, 4 centuries. "And before that?" "Before that we were on one world," I said. She was quiet again. When she spoke next, her tone had shifted to something linguistic, in my ear, flagged as the Cathari register for extended consideration. The register they used when they were speaking carefully about something that required care. "We have existed as we are," she said, "for 41,000 years. We have been cataloging the species of this galaxy for 37,000 years. We have designated 842 species in that time. Of those, 114 have ceased to exist for various reasons. Of the remainder, 61 are what we call settled species that have found a sustainable equilibrium. The others are at various stages of emergence, conflict, or consolidation." She paused. "We have never revised a classification before designation." "We understand the difficulty," I said. "Do you understand what this means?" she asked. "Not the difficulty, what it means." I thought about it. "I think it means that we are not what you thought we were." "No," she said. "We have revised our estimate before. That is not unusual. What is unusual is," she paused again, and in the pause I could hear the translation lag as linguistic worked through something in the Cathari ceremonial register that she had briefly slipped into and then pulled back from. "What is unusual is that when we look at what you have built, and how long you have had to build it, the numbers do not agree with what we know of species development." "In what way?" She looked at me steadily. 4 centuries is not enough time," she said, "to build what you have built, to organize as you have organized, to establish the doctrines and the capabilities that your fleet outside this vessel implies. We have seen species with 4 centuries of spaceflight. We have their records. They do not." She stopped. The translation lag stretched. When she continued, she was in the personal register again. "What were you doing," she said, "before you came here?" It was the right question. It was the question that, once she had asked it, I understood had been the right question from the beginning, the question that explained the discrepancy in her numbers. "We were fighting," I said, "for most of our history among ourselves. For resources, for territory, for reasons that seemed adequate at the time and looked different in retrospect. We were organized for conflict long before we were organized for space, and some of what we organized for conflict became what we use for space, and some of it became what you see outside this vessel. And before the organized conflict, we were surviving on one world. In conditions that required a specific set of capabilities, and those capabilities did not go away when the conditions improved." She was very still. "You were shaped," she said slowly, "by your origin." "Every species is," I said. "Yes," she said, "but some origins produce different shapes than others." We looked at each other across the shuttle bay floor. Outside, the nebula did what it had always done. Inside, I could hear the meridian cross breathing, the circulation systems, the low hum of the drives at station keeping, the barely perceptible oscillation of a ship that had been built to hold its position for as long as it needed to. The classification we had prepared, the Archkeeper said eventually, was Class 5, a young emergence. Yes. We will not use it. What will you use? She took a long time to answer. When she did, she used a word in Cathari standard that linguistic rendered in my earpiece as, approximately, peer. The translation note appended to it said, closest available equivalent. Original carries connotations of mutual unknowing, encountering something for which no prior category exists. That word is not a class, I said. No, she said, it is not. There was a quiet after that which was not uncomfortable. The Archkeeper moved to the shuttle bay's small seating area. We had set up chairs, human and Cathari both, in the brief time between her shuttle's docking and her exit, and I followed, and we sat, and her attendant stayed by the door and mine stayed by the corridor entrance, and for a while we simply existed in the same space. She asked questions, not the formal designation questions, which I understood she had set aside for now, but genuine ones, the kind of questions that an extremely old and curious person asks when they have encountered something that has surprised them. She asked about Earth. She asked about the early period of expansion, the first centuries. She asked about the conflicts, which I described at a general level, because the specific level is long and the Archkeeper was old and patient but not infinite. She listened with the Cathari manner of listening, which is not visually obvious but which, once you know to look for it, you can see in the absolute stillness they hold when something has their full attention. At one point she asked me about the other species we had encountered, how many, and in what circumstances. I told her, 43 confirmed contacts over roughly 2 centuries of active expansion, of which the majority had been peaceful in their eventual resolution, and a smaller number had not been. The ones that were not peaceful, she said. How did they resolve? Differently, I said. Some of them are ongoing. Some of them resulted in agreements after some time had passed. Some of them resulted in agreements that did not hold. I paused. We have a word for the kind of peace that comes after a conflict. It is different from the word for peace that was never interrupted. What is the difference in your language? I thought about how to render it in something linguistic could translate adequately. The interrupted kind carries the memory of what ended it, I said. You know the shape of the interruption, so the peace is not quite the same. It is held with more awareness of what it contains. She was still for a long time. The convocation has a similar distinction, she said. We use it rarely. Most of our peaceable relationships were never interrupted. She looked at me. How many of yours were? More than half, I said. She absorbed this. I could not read the reaction in the way I could read a human face, but the quality of her stillness shifted, not toward distress, not toward judgment, but toward something that felt like the particular attention of a person updating a very large and carefully maintained record. And yet you sent one diplomat, she said, to speak for all of it. We generally do, I said. She asked me about the Bureau, what it was, how it functioned, who authorized it. I explained the structure as best I could, aware that 41,000 years of a different kind of governance made direct translation difficult. But the Archkeeper was not a person who required everything translated perfectly. She was a person who collected information and processed it at her own rate, and she collected what I gave her and processed it in the silences between my sentences, and asked the next question that the processing produced. I asked her questions too, about the convocation, about the designation process, what it meant to other species, how it had been received by the 842 species who had received it. She told me about some of them, and I listened, and I understood after a while that what she was telling me, under the surface of the specific stories, was, We have been doing this for a very long time and most things fit, and you are the thing that did not fit, and I am trying to understand what it means when something doesn't fit." I did not have a clean answer for her. What I had was my honest experience of being human, which is that we are a species that has always arrived somewhere and found that the existing understanding of us was incomplete, and that we have learned to accept this not as a wound but as information. We are generally not what anyone expected. We have stopped being surprised by that. We have not, in my experience, ever stopped noticing it. The Archkeeper's shuttle left 12 hours after it arrived. She did not stay for a ceremony. The designation, whatever form it would eventually take, was still pending the convocation's review. What she took back with her was the conversation we had had, and the sensor logs her attendants had been quietly accumulating throughout, and whatever she had concluded in the long silences between her questions and her answers. I stood in the shuttle bay and watched the Cathari craft clear the dock and cross toward the flagship, and then I went back to my assigned cabin and sat down on my bunk and felt, for the first time since we had arrived in the nebula, the full weight of what had just happened. This is the part I find difficult to render accurately, because it was not a triumphant feeling. People assume it would be. They assume that any encounter in which humanity's estimation is revised upward is a thing that feels like winning, and I have never found a good way to explain that it doesn't, not exactly, not at the time. What it feels like, at the time, is a particular kind of weight. Because what the Archkeeper had asked me in the shuttle bay was, "What were you doing before you came here?" And what I had told her was the truth. We were fighting among ourselves on one world for a very long time, and the capabilities we built for that fighting became the capabilities that brought us here. And that is a true thing, and it is a useful thing, and it is, in the specific context of an interstellar first contact, with an ancient civilization that had prepared to classify us as young and found they could not, an impressive thing. But it is also just true. We are not impressive because we intended to be. We are not the thing that surprised the Cathari convocation because we planned to surprise them. We are the thing we are because of what we came from, and what we came from was not gentle, and what we built in the process of surviving it was built for survival rather than for elegance. And the elegance came later and is still, compared to 40,000 years of Cathari refinement, very recent. We are a species 4 centuries into space that carries the equipment of an origin it did not choose. And when an ancient civilization comes to name us and finds their classification doesn't hold, the weight of that is not pride. The weight of that is knowing what the classification was built on. It is knowing that we earned our way out of the Class 5 file the hard way, and that the hard way left marks, and that those marks are visible, and that being visible is not the same thing as being celebrated. The Archkeeper understood this, I think, or she was beginning to. The word she had given me, peer, mutual, unknowing, no prior category, was a word that contained both things. We see you, and we don't have a file for you, and that means we will have to start one. The Cathari fleet departed the following morning. Before the Archkeeper's flagship entered its translation point, a final transmission arrived on a diplomatic channel, addressed to me personally, in a Cathari register linguistic flagged as formal personal, used between parties who have concluded an exchange that will require further time to fully interpret. It said, "We will need to speak again." I wrote back, "We will be here." We departed the Spur Nebula 4 hours later. Meridian Cross and the fleet, and the escort formation, 41 vessels going dark again as we crossed out of the nebula's boundary and back into clear space, because old habits hold their shape longer than the conditions that made them necessary, and because we had been built for the kind of travel where you don't announce yourself until you decide it's time. I filed my contact report on the transit home. It was the longest report I had written in 14 years. I filed it and looked at what I had written and thought about the Archkeeper's question. What were you doing before you came here? and about the honest answer I had given her, which was that we were surviving, and which was true, and which is the kind of true thing that sounds like an explanation but is also something else. I thought about what the Bureau would do with what had happened. The formal designation was still pending. The Cathari had made clear they were not going to issue the Class 5, and were not yet ready to issue whatever replaced it. And so the Bureau would have a gap in its files where the designation was supposed to sit. Bureaucracies do not enjoy gaps in files. There would be, I imagined, considerable discussion about what to do with the gap, and that discussion would eventually produce some interim language that satisfied nobody, but kept the filing system in order until the Cathari finished their review. This is not a criticism of the Bureau. It is simply how things work when you are trying to apply a system to something the system was not designed for. What I found harder to file, sitting at the desk in my cabin with the completed report in front of me, was the weight I had described earlier. The weight of the encounter that is not triumph and is not pride, but is something more complicated than either. The Cathari Archkeeper had looked at our fleet and our hull and our weapons she couldn't quite locate and had asked, "What were you doing before you came here?" And the honest answer, the completely unadorned true answer, was that we had been fighting each other. For resources, for land, for ideology. For the kind of reasons that look smaller with distance than they do in the moment, and some of which still look large even now, and some of which have produced consequences we will be living with for longer than the Cathari have been cataloging species, if we are fortunate enough to persist that long. We had come to space carrying all of that. The organizational structures built for war, made into the organizations that built the fleet. The manufacturing capacity developed for large-scale conflict, redirected to large-scale construction. The doctrinal frameworks developed for engaging unknown adversaries under time pressure, applied to exploration. The instinct to understand a space before you announce yourself in it, to be quiet and patient, and let the information come to you before you decide what you are. All of it had come with us, because you do not shed the shape your origin gave you simply because the context has changed. You carry it into the new context, and it does what it has always done, and sometimes what it has always done turns out to be exactly what is needed, and the fact that it was not designed for this specific purpose does not make it less effective. The Archkeeper had said, "You were shaped by your origin," and I had said, "Every species is," and she had said, "But some origins produce different shapes than others." That is, I think, the most accurate description of what happened in the Spur Nebula that I know how to write. Not that we were stronger than the Cathari, or more capable, or more prepared. Not that our fleet was larger or our hull was better or our weapons were systems they had never categorized before. We were shaped by what we came from, and what we came from was a particular kind of adversity, sustained over a very long time. And what it shaped us into was something that an ancient and patient civilization, which had been forming its own shape for 40,000 years in considerably more comfortable conditions, had not seen before. I did not feel triumphant about this. I did not feel ashamed of it either. What I felt was the same thing I felt looking at the maintenance plaques on the shuttle bay bulkhead, the ones the Archkeeper had looked at so carefully. The ones on the older systems that had been repaired multiple times and kept running because they were still sound, and there was no particular need to replace them with something newer when the existing thing still did what was required. You look at something like that, and you understand that the age of it is not a flaw. The repair marks are not a flaw. They are evidence of a thing that has been in use for a long time and has continued to function through the various circumstances that befell it. And that is not something to feel triumphant about or ashamed of. It is simply what it is. That is what the Archkeeper saw when she looked at us, I think. Not youth, not the raw, unformed early stages of a species that would eventually, in time, become something of note. She saw the repair marks, the old systems still running beside the new ones, the evidence of a thing that had been in use for a very long time in difficult conditions, and had continued to function. She had needed a new category for it. Peer, mutual unknowing, no prior file. It is also the kind of thing that an ancient, patient civilization, which has seen 842 species emerge and develop, and some of them cease to exist, has to sit with for a while before they know what to do with it. The Cathari would sit with it. They would revise their file. They would come back to us, eventually, with a word or a classification or a new category they hadn't needed before, and we would receive it in the spirit it was offered, and the relationship would develop from there. The way all things develop, slowly, with occasional surprises, shaped by what came before. That is what first contact is at the end of it, when it goes the way ours went. It is not a moment. It is the beginning of a long recalibration, for both sides, and the moment itself. The ships in the nebula, the Cathari fleet going still, the Archkeeper crossing 40,000 kilometers in a shuttle to sit in a chair and ask a human what her species was doing before it arrived, is only the first step in understanding something that will take much longer to fully see. She had come to name us. What she found in the end was that she needed a new name, not just for us, for the category of thing we were. We had been in the dark 11 days in their nebula before they arrived. We had not told anyone we were there. We had not announced ourselves or signaled our approach or made ourselves known until it was time, because that is a thing that the origin teaches you, in its way, how to be quiet in a space, and how to wait, and how to let what you are speak for itself when the moment comes. The moment came. I think about the Archkeeper's face, in the shuttle bay, when I told her what we were before we came here. I think about the Cathari ceremonial register she slipped into and then pulled back from, and what linguistic had been working to render, and the word she had given me instead. Peer. The one who arrived and for whom no prior category existed. I have been in first contacts where we impressed people. I have been in first contacts where we confused people. I have been in first contacts, a few of them, where we frightened people. This was the first contact where we were simply new information to a people who had thought they had old enough data. The first contact where the thing we were was genuinely different from the file, and the difference was not a surprise we planned, but the accumulated weight of everything we had been, arriving in a room where someone had prepared for something lighter. The nebula, when we left it, was doing what it had always done. The young star cluster at its heart was building itself, slowly, out of gas and time, and the ordinary physics of accumulation. 8 million years of becoming, and no end in sight, and no one in particular watching. We had been in there 11 days. That is all. We had been in there 11 days and held our silence and let them come to us, and when it was time, we turned on the lights.